Hi, Johnny.
All
How you
right.
doing today?
Great. I'm so
Yeah.
excited to meet you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to meet you too, finally in person. I'm super curious about, I mean, first of all, like, I know a little bit about Equal Justice USA, but can you just kind of give me, like, what's the elevator pitch of, like, what y'all do and what makes you excited
Yeah.
going forward?
Yeah. So Equal Justice USA is a national organization, and we work with impacted communities, those impacted most directly by violence, to interrupt the cycles of violence, to address the drivers of violence. And we do it in a few ways. One of them is to stop state violence. That's our work to stop executions and to reduce the harm of the current system. The other way is through building community safety, and that's where we really partner with grassroots organizations and community leaders who are doing the hard work on the ground of addressing drivers like poverty, trauma, isolation. And then we do advocacy work, and we do that through building key constituencies and partnerships. Essentially, our vision is for a world where violence is rare, and we can't achieve a vision that big in silos. So our constituency work is really finding unlikely allies and coming together to do the work.
Well, unlikely allies, I feel like opera singers is probably not on your normal list. I correct me if I'm wrong, but your sort of first big career was as a prosecutor. Is that true? So like, what made you decide to work on this issue from the outside of the criminal justice system rather than what you were doing, which was from the inside?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I will try to keep this answer.
That's okay. We can edit it.
But it's essentially the journey I've been on in my professional career is the journey that we're hoping to take the world on. So I took the role as a prosecutor, 4 years out of law school, trying to find a way to make a difference. I took it with eyes open though. I'd already seen, by that being a young adult, how the system didn't treat Black people the same. I already had cousins who'd been incarcerated, and I also knew from the victim side. My father was a victim of a robbery that left him with a severe brain injury, and so how the system treats Black victims also not well. So I came in eyes open, wanting to be a power holder, to use your power. Prosecutors are very powerful in the system, to try to fix what in my mind at the time was broken. So what I found in the system is that I came in wanting to make it different, to hold the power differently as a prosecutor, but recognize that the system actually isn't broken. And it was really once I had a chance to come outside and really study our history that I learned that there was real intentionality in how the system was set up, going all the way back to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as punishment for crime. And that the system was intended to control and oppress the formerly enslaved, and that it still plays out in the way the system operates today. And so now where I am in my journey is recognizing that if we truly want safety and we want thriving communities, that the solutions are going to be on new foundations, not racial oppression. They've got to be rooted in healing. They've got to be rooted in care. They've got to be rooted in love. And that's what drew me to the work at Equal Justice USA.
That's so beautiful because I think that, so often that we can easily agree with the first half of your statement of like, this is how this thing was built. And it's a huge problem, but sort of then going the next step of like, what next do we build to actually like work on this problem instead of just saying, this is all terrible, which we kind of all, I think most of us anyway, or a lot of us in sort of my circle really agree with. So I'm curious, like hearing kind of that the mission, both your personal mission and EJUSA, what's something that's like a sort of concrete thing that y'all do that you're proud of or that you have done in the past that's like, here's kind of how that would work in real life?
So the work that we're very proud of and that we're trying to share in the world is what's happening at Newark. Newark is a place where we've been working for about 8 years. So it's not, again, these are complex problems. There's not like a single solution that solves all of violent crime. But when you have a real commitment, and they do in their leadership, and Mayor Rasbaraka, who comes from generations of community activism, and truly took the role, declaring violence as a public health issue that needed a response to address those drivers from that standpoint versus punishment. And so in Newark, what exists right now is what we refer to as a community-led ecosystem, public safety ecosystem. And so what that means is instead of the police being the sole response when something happens, what we documented in a report, and if folks want to learn more about this, they should go to newarksafety.org. But 23, I'm going to say, pieces, organizations that make up that ecosystem, so that when, for instance, the police encounter a youth who is, it's clear to them they're dealing with some issue, instead of arresting and booking and putting them in a system that's only going to exacerbate whatever trauma or whatever issue it is, they can call the Hub, which is a center that is geared towards youth, that is a trauma-informed center and can help meet those needs. And that's just, there's so many pieces of that ecosystem that is working that way, and we know it's working. Newark is at a 60-year low in homicides and has been able to maintain that even in 2021 when across the country gun violence rates went up. It didn't matter you had a blue or red or purple, it went up across the country. Newark was an aberration and continues to be an aberration. So we know these solutions work.
That's beautiful. I love there's something really that appeals to me about the kind of pilot program idea that's something that if you can make work in one place, you can sort of repeat that. And also the, looking at it through a local lens first, rather than, so often I think in the media, for those of us that aren't really in the, criminal justice reform world, it feels like these problems are so national, and it can be easy to feel overwhelmed by that. But when you look at it more locally, it feels like, that seems like something we could really do.
Yes. And what we've learned is that usually the drivers, where crime is happening, where harm is happening, it's usually driven by a very small number of people, and it's in specific neighborhoods. Not the entire city of Newark that is dealing with, shootings and other types of harm. They're very particular neighborhoods and often very particular blocks. And you can get that specific and involve the folks who have relationship at that level, you have a much better chance of success than just painting a broad stroke of the answer to this is punishment. And so we need to increase our penalties. We need to increase, flood the blocks with police. And there's really research to support this too. I think a lot of times the punishment frame is used for deterrence. That's how we stop someone from pulling the trigger, is if they know the penalty is now 60 years instead of 30 years. That's just not the case. It's just not the case. It is really fear of apprehension, so that's why if it's a well-lit area or you have cameras up, you're more likely to get deterrence than to increase mandatory minimums on a particular type of crime.
Love the idea of it being a health crisis issue rather than violence per se. Because violence is so part of a bigger ecosystem.
And I'll add to that this is why a race equity lens is so important, because it's not that we are not willing to see someone who's caused harm as themselves a person who has needs and almost always has been the victim of some type of trauma that have led them down the path. We do have that happen. We see it more in our juvenile justice system, where the goal is different. It's about, how do you kind of bring a child back into society and what do they need. But even in that system, there's a lot of racial disparities in who gets the service and who gets commitment, which is the term for juvenile prison. And so the race equity lens is really important, because part of it is a willingness to see the humanity in those who cause harm. And when you see them as a person, and particularly be willing to see them as a victim or survivor first, our response to what they've done is very different than just lock them up and throw them away forever. So the pushback to thinking about our violent crime problem as a public health issue versus a crime issue is really that we have been committed to a system of punishment as response. And it does require us to almost own it ourselves as a society that we have made this worse. When we think about what drives violence, it's things like isolation, it's poverty, it's trauma. We put people in prisons where what they experience is poverty. They get pennies on the dollar, pennies per hour for work. They're isolated, they're dehumanized, their name is taken away, they're given a number, they cost exorbitant cost just to even be able to call families, let alone see them. So we put them in the very drivers that drive violence, and then 95% of people come home. So for us as a society to say, oh, we did this, I think sometimes it's hard. We'd much rather say, you did this. You're the bad person, and it's our job to put you away so that you don't hurt us good people. But that dichotomy is so false, and that is literally how our system is set up. It is adversarial. It is prosecutors to protect us. They are for our good communities, and the defense counsel are really to protect the rights of that bad person who did something bad and try to minimize the time that they get. And really, any of us on any day could make a decision that puts us in the same position. And we need to understand that dichotomy is just false. We all, and anyone who's worked in the system for a long time knows that your victim today can be your defendant tomorrow, can be your witness the next day, because so much of what's happening is within the same neighborhoods and communities.
So for people like me and people that might be watching this through the opera world, that people can do to help support EJUSA, what are the next steps for the organization? What are you hoping for in the future?
Yeah. So one, sign up on our website and follow our work and support our work and share it. Even this conversation we're having is a conversation that, I get to have it all the time, but so many people never step back and even question what we do as the status quo. And so people don't participate in electing their DAs, their sheriffs, they have no idea most of the time who they even are, let alone what platforms they stand on. There's very little advocacy and involvement by the average person in the budget decisions being made in their county or in their city. And as people who live in our communities, we have voice and we have influence. We elect these leaders. And so being engaged and asking questions and pushing for, I don't want the status quo. I want something that's actually going to make the situation better by addressing the drivers. And that requires resources. So a lot of our advocacy work is around shifting resources. How do we resource the trauma-informed responses versus the punitive ones that are only making things worse?
Is there anything else that you would want people to know, or is there anything that I haven't asked that's like I need to make sure to say this?
Just that this work takes all of us. It really isn't just for, I feel like it's a blessing and a privilege that I get to do it every day, but we all have to care. We all have to not become desensitized to the person who's in need on our block and our community, because for us to change this big problem, it is not going to be left up to just government, just up to organizations. It really takes all of us, and it can really start at the block level. Who on your block is in need of something? How can we truly make sure that people aren't isolated, that needs are being met? Because those are the ways that we stop those drivers. It's truly through love and care for one another. So Ryan, we're so excited to get your call and that you're interested in learning about our organization. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, so I've been interested in criminal justice issues for quite a while. As an opera singer, it seems like such a strange way to get into it, but I often am playing bad guys, for lack of a better word, who, once you dig into any person, as I've already heard you talk about, people always, nearly 100% of the time, people who do quote unquote bad things have had trauma in their lives, are victims of violence first. And that's true with these characters who are sometimes real historical people. So for example, I'm singing the role of Joseph Desrochers in the opera Day Man Walking at the Metropolitan Opera here in a few weeks. And he's created actually off of a few different real life people that Sister Helen Prejean wrote about in her book, Day Man Walking. And that really led me to just having some curiosity about the system in general, specifically around capital punishment. I started writing with some prisoners, specifically some folks on death row, and kind of became friends with one. His name was Terrence Andrus. And he very, very much aligns with the story that you are telling. He, grew up in a very poor neighborhood in Houston that had historically, racist laws that really like created this separation in wealth over time, and in crime and in services and education and everything, and therefore had a broken family and had to take care of his siblings, and was also had mental health issues that were not addressed as a young person, ended up in the juvenile justice system in a really bad situation, ended up killing 2 people in a carjacking, and ended up on death row. And he and I became pretty close, and I visited him several times, and we wrote over several years, and I just started to feel so clearly that that could have been me, that I had struggles as a teenager with the law, and I was the very classic, like, I came from a family that had some means, and I'm a white man, and people said, he's actually a good kid, like, we should give him a chance to do better. And I did, because that's what happens when you're given a chance, like almost everybody, right? If you're given enough chances. And Terrence never got those chances. He was just sucked up by the system at every level and never given any kind of care. And yet he became a really interesting and wonderful person, and an artist. He wrote all this poetry and created all this art, and was a good friend. Like, he cared about me and what was happening in my life and my family. So his case went to the Supreme Court twice. The first time, they told Texas they had to look at it again, which was really a good thing. There was a lot about his case that meant he shouldn't have been there anyway. And of course, in my opinion, no one should be there. And then when the court became more conservative a few years ago, it went back, and then they rejected it. And after that, he kind of went into a mental health spiral, and then he took his own life earlier this year. So that's kind of, thank you. That's sort of the backstory of that. But I had also been looking for, as I start to work on Dead Man Walking again, working with some organizations that align with my thinking about all of it, and that I could sort of help tell people about when I'm talking about this piece and about Terrence, so that there can be, instead of just sadness about how horrible this situation is, which it really is, some feeling of like, we could do something. I was doing some research, and I stumbled on the website for EJUSA, and just the language around treating people as full human beings, like you were saying, and also a community-based approach, and working with people's trauma. I think those are all like such huge values of mine, and I hadn't seen them sort of enacted in that way. And I just think the work that you're doing is really beautiful. I'm excited I think I'm gonna have a chance to see the folks at the Hub specifically. And so, yeah, I'm just a big fan of y'all's, and I just want people to know that there are really great organizations out there doing that kind of work. And that's, when you have that energy of like, this is terrible, what do I do about it? Instead of just doom scrolling on Instagram or whatever, go to EJUSA and see what's happening that you can maybe, work on to make real progress. Because as you say, with the situation in Newark, it's possible. It's not out of the realm of what we can do.
Yes. There's so much in what you share that resonates deeply, because so not only do we incarcerate more than any other place in the world, right? Less than 5% of the world's population, but more than 20% of the world's incarcerated population here in the US. We also do very little opportunity of looking back, right? So once we make the decision, we're gonna give you life, or we're gonna take your life, and then we know this thing takes decades. People are not, it's 20 years, 30 years, they are living on death row or living in prison. And we never recognize that, guess what, that 17-year-old who did this, or that 21-year-old who did it, who's now 44, who's now 53, is a different person, fundamentally different person than they were when they made that decision. And we've no process to recognize that we change as human beings, and that we shouldn't be held for a decision. They are the rest of our entire lives, that, especially when we understand how those decisions are made, and often made from a place of trauma and hurt and unmet needs. And we're unique in that. In so many countries, the death penalty does not exist. In so many countries, you can't get more than 30 years, period, no matter how many people you kill, because there's a recognition at some point you need to come home. And in many other countries, even how you're treated, it's very much, we call it rehabilitation, but again, just all we have to do is look inside, and there are some great documentaries and folks who've been able to go inside and film or take pictures, and it is clear there's nothing rehabilitative about a space where everything from your food to lack of medical care is not, you're not treated as human. And when you look in other countries where, like Norway and other places where truly it is, you are going to do your hardest emotional work because the idea is for you to come back home and be productive. So, to me, all of that is deeply rooted in our legacy of slavery. It is because we built this system on the backs of how do we control formerly enslaved, and that mindset has never shifted. So there's a lot of work to do, but it's also why I'm excited to be part of a work that recognizes the solutions aren't in a system like that, and that we can resource and build up those solutions, and that they work.
So you talking about sort of our legacy of slavery and how that has sort of held over into the way we deal with criminal justice reminds me of, we lived in Germany for a long time, and one of the things that always struck me is that, obviously, like, the Holocaust is, one of the worst things to ever happen in the history of humankind. The way Germany has handled dealing with that as a country and as a society, to say, this is a thing we did. Yes. We really did do this.
Yeah.
And you see it from, signs on doors when you're walking down the street of, a Jewish person was taken from their home here. And we kind of don't have that in this country. We've never really had the moment of, yes, like, we argue about it a lot, but as a whole society, we haven't said slavery is a real thing that we did, and it was wrong, and here are the things we're going to do to address it, both for people that affected, to say, we're sorry, like, this, we shouldn't have done this, but also to say, what can we do to untangle that? Yes. Because if we don't address that, how do we function? Like, how do we move forward with that? I mean, as you say, that every single part of society has remnants of that, and so if we don't do the work to sort of disentangle that, it's really difficult to move forward.
Yeah, we don't get to reconciliation without truth.
Yeah,
and we have struggled in this country just to even deal with the truth. So how can we get to reconciliation? And I think it's even worse right now, right? I feel like there was a moment after George Floyd was murdered. There was this sort of desire across, really like nationally, to learn more, to question how could something so brutal happen over a 9-minute period, just so brutal, so, there was no regard for life. And I remember the New York Times bestseller list that summer had all of these books, like How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility, it was clear people were seeking and wanting to learn. And Jeff Robinson at the ACLU has an amazing project, the Who We Are Project, that talks about how our history chronicles racism in America. And there's a point where he talks about how every time there's progress, there's backlash. I mean, Reconstruction is the biggest example of that. After Reconstruction was then Jim Crow. And so George Floyd's murder prompted this progress, where begin to have some progress. And now we're in that backlash period where I feel like the fact that people wanted to learn the truth is now under attack. And now what we see are books being banned. And this wholesale attempt to literally rewrite history. So your point about Germany being different, because they have reckoned with the truth, and not just reckoned with it, they have left monuments all over the place. I've read about the cobblestones in the street where you see names. Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, it really draws that distinction between Germany and the US, because what we did was erect monuments to the Confederates, and that's what we decided to kind of memorialize and uphold, not those who were the victims, and really trying to uphold and own the harm, the great harm that happened. So that's such an important point. Thank you for raising it.
I think from one of the challenges for me as a very privileged white man, is I think that there's on one level, I want to do what's right, but there's also trying to understand like how that process could also help heal people like me, right? Because there's a different sort of generational trauma that comes from being the oppressor, and having like sort of being forced to lie to yourself about the way the world is. And I think that people like me tend to underestimate how much freedom there is in seeing the truth. Because, I found as a younger person this real, before I did a lot of this work with myself and trying to learn about it, a real divide between myself and people I knew who were people of color, for example, or people who had less financial privilege than me, or because I was forced to think, well, my family just did it better than that, right? That's why but of course there's something in that feels inherently wrong, and I then, I'm questioning, like, am I really worth anything? Like, because you're sort of trying to live this lie. And then the act of like really going through the truth, you can start to connect to those people in real ways and understand like, oh, actually, like this is a burden for white men too. And I want to say that in a really clear way, that I don't mean that it's equal at all, but just that there's healing to be done for everybody, and that being part of that process can be really gratifying, even on a personal level. And it doesn't mean that you have to, I think I think many white men think that if you engage in this kind of work and look at the truth, that you're forced to just like, whip yourself all day long because you're a horrible racist. And while, looking at the truth can be painful, I think it's also, you're in a way freed from that history by like actually reconciling, even with just the people even if it's not a societal thing, but just as a personal thing. So that's kind of drawn me to that as a way of connecting with people who I had felt disconnected from earlier in my life.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's central to reconciliation is relationship. And by owning the truth and not being afraid to question sort of the stories that you were told that made you see people differently or see yourself differently. When you said, questioning if the story isn't true, am I worth anything? I immediately thought what it actually is telling you is that everyone is worth something, but that we've got structures in place that doesn't see everyone's worth. But the fact that you can truly have authentic relationship comes from a willingness to do that reckoning, and then reconciliation is relationship. It's being able to see people, know their story, and every time we're going to see that there's much more we have in common than separates us. But I think there's a lot of intention to keep us separated. In fact, a lot of people believe that the reason Martin Luther King truly, where they got to the point where he must be killed and can no longer be out there, was because he was doing the work of bringing Black and white poor people together and unifying. And that could not be allowed, because the introduction of racial division was how slavery was able to be sustained. And so, so much of what you're talking about to me is just this great example of the healing journey that we can all go on if people are willing.
Beautiful. Chami, it's been so wonderful to talk to you. I'm so excited about working with EJUSA and seeing what y'all do next and being your cheerleader out there in the world. Thank you for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
And I just want to say thank you. That the work of storytelling is so important in how we get people to do things differently. So much of what happens in these bad policies and bad laws is driven by a narrative. It's driven by fear. It's driven by that white people are dangerous, that we must protect ourselves. So having the counter narratives that no, people who are in prison are human beings who have been hurt in deep ways, who have values still to give, is so important. So thank you for telling those stories.
Thank you. Thank you.